A millionaire sees a beggar woman with 2 children on the street. And he did shocked everyone. But before we start the story, tell us in the comments which city you are watching us from. We hope you enjoy the story. Ethan Carter walked through the bustling streets of downtown, surrounded by towering skyscrapers and bright signs. For most people, that scenario was impressive, but for him, it was just routine. The fast pace of footsteps, the sound of impatient horns, and the unknown faces that hurried by. All of this has been part of your world for a long time. A millionaire before the age of 30, owner of one of the most influential companies in the financial sector, Ethan had achieved everything he had always dreamed of. Money, influence, a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city. On paper, his life was perfect. But the truth is that in the midst of so much success, he had lost his way. That afternoon he was crossing the street after an exhausting meeting when something caught his eye. It wasn't a shiny billboard or a flashy sports car. It was a common scene for many, but it made time stop for him. There, sitting on the cold floor of the sidewalk, a woman tried to calm 2 small children. Their clothes were worn, and their hair disheveled and their skin dirty gave away that they had been there for too long. The girls, who looked like twins, were around 4 years old and held each other's small hands as if they were the only thing left in the world. One of them cried softly, rubbing her eyes with clenched fists. The other just watched the movement of the street, but her frightened look showed that she understood more than she should for her age. "Honey, Wani, it's okay." "Someone will help us," whispered the woman in a choked voice, trying to look strong to her daughters. Even when everything seemed to be hopeless, Ethan's heart raced. He knew that voice. Even if the years had passed, even if the pain and fatigue had transformed his face, he would never forget it. Sophie Evans, the girl whom years ago he watched from afar at school, without ever gathering the courage to approach. The girl who seemed unreachable, surrounded by friends and smiles who didn't even know he existed. The same girl who, one day, laughed at him when she caught him trying to write a love note and never gave him another chance. Now, there she was, completely unrecognizable. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. What had happened for Sophie to get to that point? How was the girl who once seemed to have it all now in that desperate situation? He didn't know it, but something inside him said he couldn't just move on. For a moment, Ethan stood still, unable to move. The city around him followed its frenetic pace. Cars honked, people hurried, shops glittered with impeccable windows, but for him, all was silent. There before him stood Sophie Evans, someone who once seemed to have a bright future, now reduced to a shadow of her former self. He could just ignore it and get on with his life, as anyone there would. He could convince himself that this scene was not his problem, that he had already done his part in the world by donating large amounts to charity. But then, her words echoed again. "Someone will help us." But no one helped. People hurried past, looking away as if they didn't want to see. It was easier to pretend that they didn't see, that it wasn't with them, but for Ethan it was now impossible to ignore. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Sophie?" The woman raised her head slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. Her gaze met his, and for a moment she seemed to search for some distant memory in the back of her mind. And then, his face turned pale. "Ethan?" The silence between the two became heavy, full of untold stories, of memories that were once real and now seemed part of another life. Ethan watched as Sophie lowered her gaze, as if she wanted to disappear, as if the shame was greater than any words she could say. "What happened to you?" His voice came out before he could control himself. Sophie held her daughters instinctively, clutching them against her as if she feared someone might snatch them from her arms. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "We're fine, you should go, but she was not well, none of them were." Ethan realized this when he looked at the girls. Small bare feet touched the cold ground, and their little clothes, which had once been colored, were now frayed and dirty. One of them still held her mother's dress tightly, while the other seemed tempted to hide. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a genuine revolt against the injustice of the world. Sophie Evans, the girl who one day laughed with her friends in the hallways of school, who always seemed to know what to say, who exuded confidence. Now she was there, alone, asking for a miracle that never came. He knew he couldn't change the past, but I could do something at that moment. "You're coming with me," she looked up in surprise. "What? You and the girls?" Now. Sophie shook her head nervously. No, Ethan, I can't. This is not certain. What is not certain is that you and your daughters spend the night here in the cold, not knowing when they will eat again. The little girl who was crying softly held her mother's dress even tighter, as if she felt her fear. Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I was tired of fighting, tired of pretending that she could still do it on her own. Her voice cracked, and Ethan knew that at that moment she was about to give in. He took his cell phone from his pocket and called his driver. I need you to bring the car now. Sophie was still hesitating. Why? He asked quietly. Ethan stared at her seriously. Because I can help. And because, this time, I won't ignore it. A few minutes later, a black luxury car pulled up on the street. The driver got out and opened the door. Ethan bent down, picking up one of the girls in his arms, feeling how light she was. Sophie grabbed the other and got into the car. The silence inside the vehicle was different. It was not a silence of strangeness, but of something that was just beginning. Ethan knew that night would change everything. What he didn't know was that by helping Sophie, he was also about to change his own life forever. Night had already fallen when the car drove through the gates of Ethan's mansion. The property's lights illuminated the entrance path, highlighting the impeccable garden and elegant facade. But to Sophie, it all seemed like a world far away, a place where she didn't belong. Sitting in the passenger seat, she looked at her daughters, who had finally fallen asleep, their faces relaxed after so long facing the cold and hunger. Their soft breathing brought momentary relief, but the tension in Sophie was still palpable. When the car stopped, Ethan got out first and opened the door for her. Sophie hesitated for a moment before leaving. Her feet touched the firm ground of the entrance, and she felt a shiver, not of cold but of uncertainty. Come, Ethan said, his voice firm but unhurried. Let's go in. Sophie swallowed hard and nodded, stroking her sleeping daughter in her arms, before following him into the house. The entrance hall was large, illuminated by a large chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. The marble floor reflected the soft lights, and everything seemed impeccable, as if it belonged to a parallel reality. A middle-aged woman wearing a discreet uniform emerged from the hallway. Mr. Carter, She stopped when she saw Sophie and the girls. His eyes expressed surprise, but soon softened in understanding. Good evening. Good evening, Margaret, Ethan replied. Prepare one of the guest rooms. They're going to stay here tonight. Sophie immediately turned to him. No, I can't stay here. This is not certain. Ethan crossed his arms, keeping his gaze fixed on hers. And what's the alternative? To go back to the street? Sophie opened her mouth but didn't find an answer. She knew she had nowhere to go. Each night on the streets, his strength was depleted. Their children were vulnerable, and as much as her mind screamed that accepting help was a sign of weakness, her heart knew it couldn't go on like that, at least for tonight, he murmured, lowering his gaze. Ethan nodded, accepting the small victory. Margaret, ever efficient, guided Sophie down the hallway while Ethan watched. There was something about that woman that intrigued him. It wasn't just her desperate situation, but the way in which, even at rock bottom, she still tried to hold her head high. When Sophie entered the room prepared for her and the girls, she felt out of place. The clean sheets, the soft aroma in the air, the soft bed. Everything was in stark contrast to the last years of his life. She put her daughters to bed carefully, arranging the blankets over them. She watched the small breasts rise and fall at a leisurely pace and felt a lump in her throat. She had failed them. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed and ran her hands over her face, trying to hold back her tears. That's when he heard a light knock on the door. "Can I come in?" It was Ethan. She wiped her eyes quickly and tried to look firmer. "Yes." He walked in slowly, clutching a tray with a steaming cup. "Margaret made you some tea," he said, placing the tray on the nightstand. "I think it should help you relax." Sophie looked at the tea but didn't pick it up right away. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" He leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "Because I can." "But why me?" She stared at him, her eyes full of doubt. "You didn't owe me anything." Ethan was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Maybe because one day I knew what it's like to have nothing." Sophie frowned, confused. But Ethan did not give any further details. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we talk." He turned to leave, but before he crossed the door, he heard her voice, softer this time. Ethan, thanks. He paused for a moment, then nodded and closed the door behind him. Outside, as he walked down the hallway, he realized something. That night was just the beginning. That night, Sophie took a long time to fall asleep. The fatigue was immense, but his mind did not allow rest. The high ceiling and clean sheets felt surreal, as if he was living someone else's life. For years, his world had been made up of uncertainty, nights in temporary shelters, days searching for leftover food, the constant shame of relying on the kindness of strangers. Now suddenly she was there in a safe place, with her daughters sleeping peacefully next to her. But how long would that last? The fear of depending on someone and then being discarded haunted her. I had trusted promises before, and all of them had been broken. When the sun rose, the first rays gently entered the room. Sophie woke up feeling a weight in her chest, but when she turned her head and saw her daughters still sleeping, her heart calmed down. At least for one more day, they were safe. She got up slowly, trying not to wake them, and left the room. The mansion was quiet, but the aroma of fresh coffee guided her to the kitchen. Ethan was already there, sitting at the table, with his cell phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his expression was serious, as if he were solving something important. When he noticed Sophie's presence, he looked up. "Good morning." She hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what to do. "Good morning." Can I get a glass of water?" Ethan put his phone down on the table and indicated the chair in front of him. "Sit down." "Margaret is already preparing breakfast." Sophie frowned. "I don't want to bother." Ethan let out a sigh. "Sophie, you're not bothering me. You and the girls will eat. Period." She realized that arguing would be useless. Reluctantly, he walked to the table and sat down. Minutes later, Margaret appeared, serving hot bread, fresh fruit, and coffee. Sophie couldn't remember the last time she'd seen such a hearty meal. When the plates were in front of her, she felt a tightness in her chest. It was one thing to accept help for her daughters. Another was to accept it for herself. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "You can eat it, Sophie. This is not a test." She looked away, feeling the tears threaten to overflow. I'm not used to it." Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice softer this time. "I know, but get used to it. You deserve it." Those words hit her in a way she didn't expect. She took a deep breath, picked up a piece of bread, and took her first bite. The feeling was simple, but at the same time transformative. Over the next few days, Sophie began to realize that life in that house was not as she had imagined. Ethan didn't demand anything in return. He did not treat her as someone fragile or powerless. But with each gesture of kindness, with each day that passed without him sending her away, she felt more frightened, because, deep down, Sophie knew the biggest challenge was not to survive. It was to allow himself to believe that he could truly live again. The clock on the wall was just over 9 in the morning when Sophie came downstairs holding her daughter's hands. Harper and Emma walked beside their mother, their curious little eyes exploring the immense and unknown environment. Ethan's house was so different from anything they knew. The wide hallways, impeccable furnishings, and sweet smell of fresh coffee in the air felt like they were in a world that didn't belong to them. Sophie stopped at the entrance to the dining room, watching the elegantly set table. Solid wood chairs surrounded the spacious furniture, where porcelain plates and shiny cutlery were perfectly aligned. On the street, eating anything was already a privilege. Now, faced with that hearty meal, she felt out of place. Across the table, Ethan was sitting, reviewing some papers while holding a cup of coffee. He wore a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his eyes scanned the document with concentration. When she heard the footsteps on the marble floor, she looked up and gave a discreet smile. "Good morning," he said, closing his document folder. "I hope you slept well." Sophie nodded slightly. Sleeping on a soft mattress between clean sheets and in a quiet room had been a strange experience, after so many years of uncertainty. "Yes, thank you." The girls looked at each other for a moment before running to the chairs. Their little feet tapped against the polished wooden floor, their faces lit up with childlike enthusiasm as they saw the variety of fruits, breads, and juices arranged on the table. "Mom, can we eat?" Emma asked, her voice full of expectation. Sophie felt a tightness in her chest. For a long time, the only possible answer to that question was a sad, maybe later, or even worse, silence. Seeing the excitement of their daughters over a simple meal was a cruel reminder of all they had endured. "Yes, my dears, you can eat it." The girls quickly helped themselves, Harper grabbing a slice of bread, while Emma filled the plate with fruit. Sophie, however, remained motionless. His mind still resisted the idea of being there, as if at any moment everything could fall apart. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "You should eat too," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sophie looked up at him, not knowing exactly how to respond. "I don't want to bother." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "To bother?" "Sophie, you're here because you need to be. It's okay to accept help." She looked away, feeling a mixture of shame and gratitude. "I'm not used to this," she murmured. Ethan put his cup of coffee down on the table, watching it intently. "We all go through difficult times. The important thing is what we do after them." Sophie took a deep breath, allowing herself to absorb those words. For so long, she believed that she had no more chances, that her life was doomed to failure. But what if there was still a way out? She reached out and took a piece of bread. The first bite was slow, almost as if he were breaking a silent vow of self-punishment. The warm, soft taste spread through her mouth, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt something close to comfort. After breakfast, Ethan got up, collected his documents, and took out his cell phone. "I need to sort out some things in the office. But you can feel free. Margaret can show you around the house." Sophie nodded, still feeling out of place. Shortly after Ethan left, Margaret approached with a gentle smile. "Come, I'll show you a little bit of the house." The girls held their mother's hands as they followed the housekeeper through the wide, well-lit corridors. Sophie watched everything cautiously, still trying to understand how she had ended up there. The house was not only luxurious, there was something about her that made her feel safe. And that was scary because deep down Sophie knew. Accepting that second chance meant letting go of fear, and that perhaps was the hardest part of all. Throughout the day, Sophie tried to ignore the discomfort she felt when she was in that house. Every room Margaret showed seemed to belong to a world she had never been a part of. The sophisticated furniture, the perfectly placed paintings, and the soft lighting gave an air of almost surreal perfection. Harper and Emma, however, didn't seem bothered. They ran across the soft carpet in the hallway, admired the heavy curtains that came down from the ceiling to the floor, and marveled at the immensity of the library, where shelves full of books reached high up on the walls. Sophie watched her daughters in silence. Seeing their joy warmed her inside, but it also brought a painful weight. What would happen when they needed to leave? When Margaret led them into the garden, Sophie pulled away a little, allowing herself a moment to breathe. He sat down on a wooden bench under the shade of a leafy tree and closed his eyes. The sound of her daughter's laughter mingled with the singing of the birds, and for a moment she allowed herself to relax. But his peace was interrupted when he felt someone approaching. "The house is too big, isn't it?" Ethan said, sitting next to her on the bench. Sophie opened her eyes and sighed. "Yes, a little," he smiled slightly. "I thought that too at first." She frowned, surprised by the statement. "At first? When I bought this house, I thought I was achieving everything I ever wanted, but for a long time it was empty. It was just a bunch of pretty walls with no real purpose." Sophie was silent, absorbing his words. "Now, do you have a purpose?" Ethan stared at her for a moment before answering. Now, maybe so. His answer caught her off guard. She looked away from the girls, who were running barefoot through the grass. Their sun-flushed cheeks and wide smiles were a stark contrast to the expression they used to carry when they were on the streets. "They look happy," Sophie murmured, "because they are safe." She closed her hands into fists on her lap, doubt still throbbing in her mind. "I know we can't stay here forever, Ethan." He tilted his head, watching her. "Who says you have to leave?" Sophie stared at him, surprised. "You've done more than enough. I don't want to abuse your kindness." Ethan let out a sigh, running his hand through his hair. "You're not abusing anything, Sophie, but I understand your concern. If you want to leave when you feel ready, I won't stop you." She felt something in her chest tighten. Part of her wanted to believe him. But another part, the one that had been wounded and abandoned so many times, still refused to trust completely. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan," he shook his head. "What if I say I'm not doing this because I owe you something? What if I tell you I want to help you because I believe you deserve a second chance?" She swallowed, looking away. His words were too kind, too real. and Sophie didn't know if she was ready to accept something like that. Deep down, however, a part of her wanted to believe. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, a second chance was possible. The sky was muted shades of orange and pink as Sophie walked to the porch, watching Harper and Emma play in the garden. The girls ran among the flowers, laughing and screaming excitedly, as if the pain of the last few years had never existed. She rested her hands on the wooden railing and sighed. It was strange how, in such a short time, Ethan had become a constant presence in their lives. Not only had he offered a roof over their heads, but he really cared. Sophie could see it in the small gestures, like when he brought new toys to the girls without expecting anything in return, or when he left work early to see them before dinner. But the truth is, as much as everything seemed perfect, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was temporary. She had felt this illusion before. The idea of security had always been fleeting for her. Ethan appeared on the porch, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Sophie, leaning next to her. "They're happier than ever," he said, watching Harper and Emma. Sophie took a sip of the tea before answering. "They feel safe here, and that means everything to me." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the girls. "That's because they know they are not alone." She frowned, looking away from him. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled slightly, twirling the cup in his hands. "Family doesn't always mean blood ties, Sophie. Sometimes the people we choose to be by our side are more loyal than those who have our DNA." Sophie felt her heart tighten. For a long time she had believed that she was alone. When she was abandoned, when she lost everything, there was no one by her side. But now there was Ethan. "I know you think this is temporary," he continued, guessing his thoughts, "but you need to understand that the connection we create doesn't disappear just because you think you don't deserve it." She looked away, fiddling with the rim of the cup. "I never wanted to depend on anyone." Ethan let out a sigh, leaning against the wood of the porch. "Accepting help does not mean being weak, and allowing people to care about you doesn't mean you're taking advantage of them." Sophie bit her lower lip, fighting the wave of emotions that threatened to wash over her. I don't want girls to get attached to something that can end." He turned his face to her, his eyes gentle but intense. "What if this doesn't end?" Sophie blinked, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Ethan pulled back a bit, looking again at Harper and Emma. "I'm not doing this out of obligation, Sophie. I'm here because I want to, and if you let it, maybe one day we can be more than just strangers who crossed paths by chance." Her heart beat faster, but before she could answer, Harper ran over to them, holding a colorful drawing in her hands. "Uncle Ethan, look what we've done." The word hit her hard. Uncle Ethan. Without realizing it, the girls had already bonded with him, and at that moment, Sophie realized that maybe it was time to accept that some connections were real, even without a shared past. Night had come, and Ethan's mansion was silent. Harper and Emma were already asleep, curled up under soft blankets, breathing easy after a day full of play. Sophie spent a few minutes watching her daughters, marveling at the peace they had finally found there. But unlike the girls, Sophie couldn't relax. His heart was restless, his mind full of conflicting thoughts. She left the room with light steps, walking down the long hallway until she reached the kitchen. She took a glass of water and leaned against the marble counter, trying to organize the feelings that dominated her. What was happening to her? In the last few days, Ethan had become more than just a benefactor. He was not only the man who had offered them shelter, he had become an essential presence in their lives. Sophie noticed this in the small details. Ethan made a point of including Harper and Emma in his routine, of asking about their day, of listening carefully when the girls talked about drawings and made up stories. He laughed with them, held them when they were tired, and even made a point of keeping the children's doodles as if they were valuable works of art. He didn't have to do any of that, but he did. And then, without warning, a painful memory came over her. His own father. He never cared about her. When his mother became ill, he simply disappeared, leaving Sophie to take care of everything herself. She learned early on that blood ties did not mean loyalty. "Maybe that's why I was so afraid to trust." Ethan's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sophie." She turned quickly, finding him standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants. Without the formality of dress clothes, he looked different, more affordable. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured, looking away. Ethan walked over to the coffee maker and began to prepare a coffee without haste. "Not either," he admitted. The silence between them stretched for a few moments before he turned to face her. "What are you thinking?" Sophie let out a sigh, holding the glass of water tightly. "Maybe I've spent so much time on the run that I don't know what it means to belong somewhere anymore." Ethan rested his hands on the counter, watching her patiently. "You don't have to run away. What if I get attached and this ends?" Her voice came out more vulnerable than she intended. Ethan was silent for a moment before answering. "Life never comes with guarantees, Sophie. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't allow yourself to feel." She looked away, his words hitting a part of herself she was trying to ignore. "Harper and Emma already see you as part of their lives," he continued. "And Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I just want you to know that you don't have to carry everything yourself." Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the resistance inside her dissolve, even if only a little. She did not answer. But for the first time, she let herself imagine a future where she wasn't always alone. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't as scary as she thought. The morning dawned serenely, with the sun bathing the gardens of the mansion in golden tones. Sophie had been awake for some time, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Harper and Emma still asleep. The daughters' faces were calm, without the signs of fear and uncertainty that they used to carry on difficult days on the streets. It was strange. For the first time in years, Sophie didn't wake up worried about where she would get her next meal or where they would spend the night. But, at the same time, this new reality caused him unexpected discomfort. She got up slowly, grabbing a light blouse and leaving the room without making a sound. When he arrived at the kitchen, he found Margaret arranging some dishes and sorting out ingredients. The housekeeper offered him a warm smile. "Good morning, Sophie. Want a coffee?" She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, thank you." Sitting at the table, Sophie looked around, still feeling out of place in that refined environment. Margaret noticed his expression and smiled softly. "You look thoughtful." Sophie sighed, running her hand over her face. "I think I'm trying to understand how I got here, and if I really belong there." Margaret served him his coffee and sat down in front of him. "I've been working for Ethan for years." "And do you know what I learned about him?" Sophie looked up, curious. "He never does something out of obligation. If he decided to help you and the girls, it's because he wants to." Sophie fiddled with the cup, reflecting on the housekeeper's words. She always had to fight on her own. Since she was abandoned by her father and then betrayed by Jake, she learned that depending on others meant giving them the power to destroy her. But now Ethan was there, offering not only shelter, but something she had long thought she would never have: genuine support. And despite everything, a part of her resisted. Before she could answer, a male voice sounded behind her. "Are you okay?" Sophie turned and saw Ethan leaning against the doorframe, watching her curiously. She forced a smile. "Yes, I'm just trying to get used to it." He walked over to the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup, before sitting down next to her. "Get used to not having to carry the world on your back." Sophie let out a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe." Ethan rested his elbows on the table, leaning forward slightly. "I understand, you know." She arched her eyebrow. "Do you understand? I spent a good part of my life believing that I couldn't count on anyone, that everything I achieved would have to be by myself." Sophie stared at him attentively. "And what has changed?" Ethan gave a small smile, taking a sip of his coffee before answering. "I realize that independence does not mean loneliness." Sophie was silent. His words echoed in her mind, bringing up feelings she didn't want to face. She was always afraid to trust, but at the same time, part of her longed for someone who was by her side not out of obligation, but because she chose to be there. And Ethan was showing that maybe it was possible to have both. Perhaps it would be possible to be strong without having to face everything alone. Sophie remained silent after Ethan's words, stirring the coffee cup without actually drinking it. The weight of what he had said still hung in the air. Independence does not mean loneliness. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to accept that she could count on someone without feeling like she was giving up on herself. But trusting was something that life had taught her to avoid. Ethan noticed her internal battle and decided not to push her. Instead, he changed the subject. "I was going to leave later to solve some things in the company, but before that I wanted to show you something." Sophie frowned, surprised. "What?" He gave a half smile. "Wear something comfortable. I'll meet you in the garden in 20 minutes. She hesitated but eventually nodded. Going up to the bedroom, he found Harper and Emma awake, still sleepy, stretching out on the soft bed. When they saw their mother, their faces lit up. "Good morning, Mum," Harper said, rubbing his eyes. "Good morning, my princesses. How did they sleep?" Emma jumped out of bed and hugged Sophie around the waist. "Very well. This mattress is cute." Sophie's heart tightened. They deserved all the comfort in the world. They deserved the security they were feeling there. "Get ready, dears, let's take a walk." The girls cheered up and ran to get the new clothes that Margaret had separated. While helping her daughters get dressed, Sophie found herself smiling. Maybe Ethan was right. When they came downstairs, Ethan was already waiting for them in the garden, wearing more casual clothes and holding a set of keys. "Shall we?" "Where to?" Sophie asked suspiciously. "You'll see." They got into the car and drove for a few minutes until they reached a place surrounded by trees and a white picket fence. As soon as they got downstairs, Harper and Emma were delighted. "Horses!" Harper shouted, running to the fence, where some horses were grazing quietly. Sophie looked around. It was a well-kept stable, with a barn at the back and an open field where the animals could move freely. "Do you have a stud farm?" she asked, incredulous. Ethan laughed. "Not exactly. I support an animal rescue center. These horses were rescued from bad situations and now live here until they find a new home." Sophie turned to him in surprise. "You never mentioned that," he shrugged. "I never thought I needed it, but I thought the girls would like to know it." Harper and Emma were already fascinated, watching one of the employees feed one of the horses. Sophie watched them, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion. Ethan wasn't just helping, he was showing that he cared, really. He did not do it out of obligation nor out of pity. He did it because he wanted to. Sophie took a deep breath and looked at him. "Thank you." Ethan smiled slightly. "Why?" She looked away from Harper and Emma, who were now petting one of the horses, their little faces full of joy. "That's why." Ethan nodded but said nothing. He knew that Sophie still had barriers to break down, but for the first time, he saw something different in her eyes. Perhaps little by little she was beginning to believe that she didn't have to face everything alone, and that was a start. Sophie never believed that the past could be left behind so easily. As much as the days with Ethan and the girls were becoming lighter, there was something that kept her attached to everything she had experienced before. The past did not simply disappear. He clung to her like a lingering shadow. It was a cold day, with the wind shaking the trees in the garden. Sophie was on the porch watching Harper and Emma playing among the fallen leaves. Ethan had left early for a meeting, and Margaret was taking care of some chores around the house. She was alone with her thoughts. Ever since they arrived at the mansion, Sophie had avoided thinking about what would come next. He made no plans. She didn't make promises to herself. After all, how many times in her life did everything fall apart when she dared to dream? It was then that he heard the noise of a car approaching. His heart raced for no apparent reason. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. Margaret, who had just left the kitchen, looked at Sophie before opening the door. And then everything froze. At the entrance, standing with an indecipherable expression, was Jake. The air became heavy. The past, which Sophie was desperately trying to keep at bay, was there, knocking on her door. "Sophie," he said, his voice loaded with a tone she knew well. She felt her stomach turn. The last time she had seen Jake was when he abandoned her without hesitation, leaving her alone, pregnant, and aimless. Now, there he was, as if nothing had happened. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out firmer than he expected. Jake sighed, putting his hands in the pockets of his worn jeans. "I heard you were here. I wanted to see the girls." Sophie's blood ran cold. "You never wanted to see them before." He looked away for a moment, but soon regained his posture. "Things change. I changed." Sophie felt a wave of indignation rise inside her. "Do you change?" "Jake, you left us with nothing. You knew I was alone, and yet you chose to leave. And now it appears as if it could just undo all this?" He sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I know I was wrong, Sophie. I know I should have done things differently, but I want to fix that." She laughed humorlessly. "Fix? Do you think you can come into their lives after years and act like you're a father?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "I'm their father." Sophie felt a shiver of fury rise up her spine. "Father? You don't even know how old they are. You don't know what they like, what scares them, or what makes them laugh." You don't have the right to show up here and want a role in their lives just because you suddenly felt guilty. Jake opened his mouth to answer, but another voice interrupted the conversation. What is the real reason for your visit? Sophie turned and saw Ethan standing a few steps behind her, his eyes fixed on Jake. His presence immediately changed the mood of the conversation. Jake crossed his arms, trying to look confident. This has nothing to do with you. Ethan laughed lightly, humorlessly. It has everything to do with me. Because you're not here out of regret. You're here because you found out that Sophie is with me now. Jake didn't answer. And Sophie knew in that moment that Ethan was right. His past had not come back by coincidence, and she needed to decide whether to allow him to destroy what she was beginning to build. The silence between the three was stifling. Sophie felt her heart racing in her chest, as if she were facing a definitive choice. The past was there, personified in the figure of Jake, trying to pull her back. But the present, and perhaps the future, was just a few steps away from her, in the form of Ethan, who looked at her firmly and protectively. She needed to decide. Jake stepped forward, his eyes fixed on her. Sophie, I just want to talk. Let me talk to you, at least once. She felt the muscles in her body tense. Converse? As if words could erase years of abandonment, as if one explanation could justify all the suffering he caused. But part of her still bore the scars of the girl who once believed in empty promises, and that part hesitated. If you have something to say, Ethan's voice cut through the silence with a dangerous calm, you can say it now. Jake looked away from him, annoyed. I'm not talking to you. Ethan folded his arms, unfazed. But you found me when you got here, didn't you? So tell us right away what your intention is. Sophie noticed that Jake was starting to feel uncomfortable. He didn't expect to be confronted. He was used to having the upper hand, to running away when the going got tough. She took a deep breath. What do you really want, Jake? He hesitated for a moment before speaking. I want a second chance. Anger burned inside her. Do you want what you never gave to me and the girls? A second chance? Jake frowned. Sophie, I know I made a mistake, but life taught me a lesson. I lost everything, and I realized that I left behind the only thing that really mattered. She clenched her fists at her sides, holding back her indignation. It doesn't matter what you've lost. The point is, when I needed you, when the girls needed a father, you chose to leave us. Jake's eyes faltered for a moment. I was afraid. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. Fear? Fear of what? Of being a father, of having responsibilities. Jake ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. Yes! I wasn't ready, Sophie. I was young, immature. I thought I could start over away from everything. She felt a bitter taste in her mouth, and while you were starting over, we were on the street. No food, no home, nothing. Do you have any idea what I went through? Jake swallowed, unable to answer. Ethan remained silent, allowing Sophie to take control of the situation. He knew that this decision had to be hers. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that conversation spread throughout her body. You say you want a second chance. His voice came out lower now, more controlled. But girls are not a debt for you to pay when it suits you. They're not a mistake you can try to fix when you get the hell out of your head. Jake tried to get closer. Sophie, please. But she raised her hand, interrupting him. Harper and Emma don't need you, Jake. They already have everything they need. He blinked a few times, confused. And what does that mean? She looked at Ethan, who stood there steadfast, like an unshakable pillar. And then she realized the girls already had someone who took care of them, someone who was present in the small details, who knew what his favorite foods were, who played with them without expecting anything in return. And that someone was never Jake. His heart calmed down. It means that your presence is not needed here. Jake's face tensed. You can't stop me from seeing them. Sophie crossed her arms. I can, and I will. You've never worried about being a parent before. It won't be now, when everything is finally working out, that I'll let you mess up their lives. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but at that moment, Ethan stepped forward. His gaze was intense, full of meaning. I think that's enough, Ethan said firmly. Sophie was very patient in listening to you, but now it's time to go. Jake looked from Sophie to Ethan, realizing that he had lost any control he thought he had. He clenched his fists, but had nothing more to say. With no other option, he turned and began to walk away. Sophie watched his silhouette disappear down the road, and with that, she felt a weight leave her shoulders. The past was finally behind her. And this time there was no longer any doubt about which direction she would take. She turned to Ethan, still feeling the impact of the moment. "Thank you." Ethan just smiled. "You did it yourself, Sophie." She took a deep breath, feeling a freedom she hadn't felt in years. Yes. For the first time, she chose herself, and with that, he chose the future. The days following the confrontation with Jake were filled with tension. Sophie wanted to believe that he had given up, that those words spoken at the door of the mansion were nothing more than a last blow of wounded ego. But something inside her knew it wouldn't be that easy. She knew Jake. She knew he didn't like to lose, and the way he looked at her before he left still haunted her. Those eyes full of frustration did not belong to someone who would accept being rejected without a fight. And that's why when the phone rang that afternoon, Sophie felt a chill down her spine before she even answered. Harper and Emma were sitting on the living room carpet, surrounded by sheets of paper and colored pencils. They laughed and talked among themselves, having no idea of the storm that threatened to fall on their heads. Sophie walked to the landline phone in the house and answered, her hand slightly shaking. "Hello?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted only an instant. "Sophie." She recognized the voice right away. His stomach turned. "What do you want, Jake?" His answer came quickly and coldly. "You left me with no choice." Sophie felt the muscles in her body tense. "What are you talking about?" Jake's voice showed no hesitation. "I'm filing a request for custody of the girls." His words hit Sophie like a punch. She held the phone tighter, as if it could stop reality from crumbling around her. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can," he replied without hesitation. "I'm their biological father. That gives me rights." Panic gripped Sophie. "You never wanted to be a father, Jake. You never cared about them." "And now I do," he said, as if it were a simple and sufficient answer. Sophie laughed, but there was no humor in her tone. "No, Jake, you don't want the girls. You want revenge." He was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was more controlled, but still charged with coldness. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that a judge will decide." Sophie's heart was beating so hard it seemed to echo in her ears. "You're doing this just because I told you weren't necessary." Jake neither confirmed nor denied. "Get ready, Sophie. This will happen." The line was muted. Sophie stood there, holding the phone as if she didn't know what to do next. "Mommy?" Emma's soft voice made Sophie wake up. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her curiously, holding a purple pencil in her hand. "Is everything okay?" Sophie blinked a few times, trying to hide her panic. He forced a smile. "Yes, dear, it's okay." But it wasn't. She needed to do something. Sophie turned quickly and left the room, up the stairs to Ethan's office. When he opened the door, he was sitting behind the desk, concentrating on some documents, but it was enough to look at it to realize that something was wrong. "Sophie?" She approached and closed the door behind her. "Jake," he began, feeling his throat tighten. "He's going to file a custody request." Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately. He pushed the papers aside and stood up. "He's bluffing." Sophie ran her hands over her face, feeling the anguish grow. What if it's not? He can use the fact that he is the biological father to achieve something. Ethan walked over to her and put his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eye. "He's not going to get anything." "How can you be so sure?" Sophie asked, her voice full of despair. Ethan sighed and crossed his arms. "Because I know much better lawyers than anyone he can afford." Sophie felt momentary relief, but the worry didn't completely disappear. "This could drag on for months, Ethan. I don't know if I can handle it." He held her hand firmly. "You don't have to deal with this alone." She closed her eyes for a moment. All her life, she was used to facing things alone. But now there was Ethan, and for the first time she realized that she might not have to fight alone this time. Night fell over Ethan's mansion, but Sophie was still awake. Sitting on the bed, she hugged her knees as she stared at the window. The wind swayed the curtains gently, and the silence of the house seemed to amplify the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. She knew Jake wasn't bluffing. He was impulsive, but he was also proud. The fact that she rejected him, that she made it clear that he had no more room in their lives, was enough to make him react in a vindictive way. Sophie felt fear growing inside her. What if he could? The thought of Harper and Emma being ripped from her arms, forced to live with a man who never wanted to be a father, terrified her. She sighed, running her hands over her face. She felt exhausted, but sleep did not come. A light touch on the door made her startle. Sophie. It was Ethan. She hesitated before answering. You can come in. The door opened slowly and he entered the room, wearing a cotton shirt and sweatpants. He was barefoot, which made him look less imposing than usual, but her eyes still carried that firmness that made her feel protected. I thought you weren't sleeping, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Sophie let out a heavy sigh. I can't. Ethan crossed his arms, analyzing her for a moment before approaching. The lawyer I talked to said that Jake has a chance, but not many. Sophie looked up at him, feeling her heart race. So he can get something. Ethan sat next to her on the bed, keeping a respectful distance. He can try, but we have something much stronger than biology. Evidence. She frowned, trying to understand. Proof of what? Ethan leaned forward a little. That he abandoned you. That he never paid alimony, never looked for the girls, never showed real interest until now. That counts for a lot in a court. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. But what if he lies? Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He can try. But what does he have against you? Nothing. You didn't do anything wrong, Sophie. You took care of your daughters alone and fought for them every day. No judge is going to look at this and think Jake is the best option. She wanted to believe that. But after everything he had faced, it was hard to trust that justice would actually work in his favor. Ethan noticed the hesitation in his gaze. I promise I'll fight for you. Sophie felt her eyes burn, but she didn't want to cry. I didn't want to look weak. Ethan, why are you doing all this? He held her gaze, and for a moment she saw something different there. Because you are important to me. Silence stretched between them, loaded with meanings that both were not yet ready to admit out loud. But in that instant, Sophie realized that for the first time, she was not alone in this battle. Days later, the judicial notification time seemed to run at an odd pace. Each day that passed was a mixture of anxiety and hope. Sophie tried to act normal, to play with the girls, to pretend that everything was under control. But then on a cloudy afternoon, confirmation came. Ethan was in the office when the intercom rang. Mr. Carter, a bailiff is here. He wants to talk to Miss Evans. Sophie, who was in the living room playing with Harper and Emma, felt her body tense when she heard those words. It was real. Ethan quickly came downstairs, finding Sophie standing near the couch, her eyes wide. I'll take care of it, he said firmly. Sophie nodded, feeling her heart pound in her chest. The bailiff handed Ethan a large envelope and, after confirming Sophie's identity, left. Ethan opened the document and read it silently for a few seconds before slamming the briefcase shut. It's official, he said, looking at Sophie. Jake has filed for parental rights and wants a DNA test to prove paternity. Sophie felt her legs weaken. What does that mean? Ethan took a deep breath. It means he's trying to do it as aggressively as possible, but he made a mistake. Sophie frowned. What mistake? Ethan held up the envelope. He is claiming that he wants to be part of the girls' lives, but he has never tried to contact them before. He never paid anything. He was never interested. This can be used against him. Sophie bit her lip, trying to absorb the information. So we still have a chance? Ethan put a hand on his shoulder. We have much more than a chance, Sophie. We have the truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control her breathing. The fear was still there. But this time she wasn't facing it alone, and for the first time, Sophie felt that perhaps justice was on her side. Sophie's routine began to change in subtle but significant ways. After days of tension due to Jake's threat, she realized that she could no longer live just waiting for the next blow. I no longer wanted to be the woman who only reacted to difficulties. He needed to take control of his own life. That morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He put on a simple outfit and tied his hair in a hurried bun before going down to the kitchen. Margaret was already there, arranging the ingredients for breakfast. Good morning, dear, the housekeeper greeted with a warm smile. Good morning, Margaret, Sophie replied, taking a cup for herself. As he stirred his coffee, his mind buzzed with a thought he had been avoiding for the past few days. What was his place in the world now? For years, his only concern was survival. First in the daily struggle to feed her daughters and find a safe place to sleep. Then, when trying to understand where it fit within Ethan's unexpected generosity. But now she wanted more. He didn't just want to be someone who received help. I wanted to be someone who could help, and that's why, when Ethan entered the kitchen minutes later, she had already made a decision. I need to talk to you. He noticed the determined tone in his voice and walked over, grabbing a cup of coffee before sitting down at the table. Of course. What was it? Sophie took a deep breath. I want to find a job. Ethan didn't seem surprised. In fact, a faint smile appeared on his lips. I already imagined that you would say that at some point. She arched her eyebrow. What do you mean? Ethan took a sip of his coffee before answering. You've never been the type to stand still. I realized this from day one. Sophie looked away to the window, watching the trees swaying gently in the wind. I don't want to depend on anyone. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. And you don't. Having accepted my help does not mean that you have lost your independence. But finding a purpose of your own, that is important. She looked at him, surprised at how easily he understood her thoughts. So you think it's a good idea? He smiled. I think it's the best thing you can do for yourself. Sophie felt a warmth spread across her chest. That was it. She needed something that was hers, something that would show her daughters that she could get back on her feet. There's just one problem, she said, biting her lower lip. Which one? I have no idea where to start. Ethan laughed softly. Well, I can help with that. He pulled out his phone and typed something before looking at her again. How about we talk to a friend of mine? She runs a community center that helps women in vulnerable situations to reposition themselves in the labor market. Sophie widened her eyes. Do you know anyone like that? Yes, and I think it would be perfect for you. She felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Perhaps this was the first step towards a new future. At the community center, the next afternoon, Sophie met up with Ethan to visit the location he mentioned. It was a simple building, but well organized. At the reception, some women chatted in groups, while others attended classes in adjacent rooms. There was a wall full of information about courses, job opportunities, and success stories of women who had managed to change their lives there. An elegant woman with grey hair and a welcoming smile walked up to them. Ethan Carter. How long? Ethan smiled and greeted her with a friendly hug. Beautiful. It's great to see you. I want you to meet Sophie. The woman named Linda turned to Sophie and shook her hand firmly. Nice to meet you, Sophie. Ethan told me a little about you. Sophie felt a slight embarrassment. I hope only good things. Linda laughed. Only the best. He said that you are seeking a new path. Sophie nodded. Yes. I want to work to build something for myself and my daughters. Linda watched her for a moment before smiling. Then you've come to the right place. She gestured for them to follow her and began to introduce the space. Sophie was impressed with the structure. There were training courses, practical training, and even psychological support to help women who went through difficult situations. Many of the women who come here have gone through challenges similar to yours, Linda explained. Some fled abusive relationships, others lost everything and had to start over. What they all have in common is the desire to change their lives. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. That was where she wanted to be. At the end of the tour, Linda looked directly at Sophie. If you want, we can start with something simple. How about a business course? This would open doors to several opportunities in the future. Sophie took a deep breath. This was his chance. She looked at Ethan, who just smiled and nodded, as if to say, the choice is yours. Then, with a new twinkle in her eye, Sophie smiled. I want to try. And in that moment, she knew. The past could have been cruel, but the future was still in his hands. The following days were intense for Sophie. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something new. The business course Linda suggested seemed daunting at first. Sophie had never studied something so formal, and for a moment she wondered if she could really do it. But in the first class, she felt something different. As she sat in the bright room of the community center, surrounded by other women who, like her, were trying to start over, Sophie realized that she was not alone in this struggle. The teacher talked about basic concepts of organization and business management, and Sophie absorbed every word. For years, her survival instinct made her make quick decisions and learn to deal with unforeseen problems. Now, all of this was taking on a new meaning. After class, Sophie was talking to some women who were in the same course. One of them, named Emily, was a single mother and had lost everything after a messy divorce. I thought my life was over, Emily confessed, holding a notebook with notes. But when I got here, I realized that the world wasn't over. I just needed to rebuild it from scratch. Sophie nodded, understanding every word. She was also rebuilding. When she returned to the mansion that night, Harper and Emma rushed to hug her, excited to tell her about their day. Ethan was in the room, reviewing some documents, but when he saw her enter, he closed his briefcase and smiled. How was it? Sophie took the bag off her shoulder and sighed, but this time it wasn't a sigh of tiredness. It was satisfaction. Better than I expected. Ethan got up and walked over to her. I knew you'd do well. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. Are you always that confident? He gave a corner smile. Only when I'm sure of something. Sophie felt her heart beat faster. Ethan always showed faith in her, even when she herself doubted her ability. It was strange, miss, but at the same time, comforting. Perhaps for the first time, she was really ready to allow herself to grow. The weeks passed quickly. Sophie immersed herself in her studies with dedication, learning about administration, financial planning, and even business strategies. Linda noticed her effort and, a few weeks later, made an unexpected proposal. Have you ever thought about working here at the community center? Sophie widened her eyes. Work here? Yes, we need someone to help with the administrative part and organization of the courses. You have shown great potential, and I think it would be a great opportunity. Sophie was speechless. She never imagined that in such a short time she would already have a real chance to work. I don't know what to say. Linda smiled. Just think about it. I know it's a big step, but you're ready for it. Sophie spent the day reflecting on the proposal, and at night he decided to tell Ethan. They were on the balcony of the mansion, the starry sky above them and a gentle breeze blowing. Linda offered me a job, Sophie said, looking down at her hands. Ethan, who was holding a glass of wine, stopped in the middle of the movement. A job? That's awesome. Sophie bit her lip. But I'm afraid, what if I fail? Ethan placed the cup on the table and held her hand. Sophie, look at all that you've overcome. Do you really think you won't make it? She laughed softly. When you put it like this, Ethan gently squeezed her hand. You're ready. Take up this challenge. Sophie took a deep breath. Yes, it was time to accept. The next day he returned to the community center and gave the answer that would change everything. I accept the job. Linda smiled. Welcome to the team, Sophie. And that's how, after so many years of struggling to make ends meet, Sophie finally found her purpose. Time passed, and Sophie could hardly believe how her life had changed. Now every morning she got up early to take Harper and Emma to school before heading to the community center. His new job wasn't just a source of income. It was a purpose. She helped women who, like her, needed a fresh start, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie was not afraid of the future. That afternoon, after a long day at work, she arrived at the mansion and found Ethan in the garden. He was sitting on a wooden bench watching Harper and Emma play in the grass. When he saw her, he smiled. How was the day? Sophie sat down next to him, letting out a tired but satisfied sigh. Intense, but good. I never imagined I would say this, but I like what I do, Ethan nodded. I already knew you'd find something you loved. You have always had this strength within you. She laughed softly. You say that as if you've known me for years. He looked her in the eyes. Maybe I do. Sophie felt her heart race, but she looked away, focusing on her daughters. Harper would pick flowers and put them in Emma's hair, who laughed delightedly. They both seemed happy, and that was worth more than anything. I've been thinking, Sophie said, breaking the silence. Ethan tilted his head, curious. About what? She took a deep breath before answering. About what it means to have a home. He was silent, waiting for her to continue. For a long time, I thought that a home was just a place where you sleep, where you survive. But now, looking at the girls, looking at all this, Sophie turned to him and her voice came out full of emotion. I realize that a home is not a place, it's a feeling. It's knowing that you're safe, that there are people who care about you, who want you to stay. Ethan smiled softly. So what does this mean for you now? Sophie looked around, taking in every detail of that moment. It means that maybe I have already found my home. Ethan's gaze softened, and he took her hand gently. Sophie, you and the girls will always have a place here. Always. She felt her eyes water, but this time it wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. The past no longer had power over her, because now she finally knew where she belonged. In the days that followed, Sophie found herself reflecting on her conversation with Ethan. For so long, she believed she would never have a place to call home. Every closed door, every cold night on the street, every broken promise made her think that belonging was something reserved only for others. But now everything seemed different. One night, after putting Harper and Emma to bed, Sophie went downstairs to find Ethan on the porch looking up at the starry sky. "Have you lost sleep?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. He smiled slightly, without looking away from the horizon. "I was just thinking." Curious, Sophie walked up to him and crossed her arms. "Thinking about what?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes reflecting the soft light of the moon. "How much things have changed since you and the girls got here." She felt butterflies in her stomach. "Have they changed for the better or for the worse?" He laughed softly. "For the better. Much better." Sophie looked away, trying to hide the blush that rose to her face. Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You know you don't have to leave, don't you?" Sophie's heart raced. "Ethan, He gently held her hand. "I'm not saying this out of obligation, Sophie. I'm saying it because I want you to stay. Because somehow you brought something to this house that I didn't even know was missing." She swallowed. "And what was missing?" He smiled softly. "Life, love, purpose." Sophie felt her eyes tear up. All she ever wanted was just that, a place where she would be loved and valued. And suddenly it was clear to her. Her home was not a place. It was Ethan. It was Harper and Emma running through the garden, laughing fearlessly. It was waking up every day and knowing that I was no longer alone. Sophie took a deep breath before taking the final step. "I want to stay, Ethan." He held her face gently, a twinkle in his eye. "Then stay. Forever." And when his lips touched hers, Sophie knew. The past no longer mattered, because she had finally found her home. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you liked it, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you don't miss any of our stories. See you in the next videos.